8:25 in the morning, March 21st, 1967. A clearing in the jungle, 90 kilometers northwest of Saigon, in a place the American military had named War Zone C. A 22-year-old artilleryman is about to do something his training manual never told him to do. He's standing behind a 105mm howitzer. This is a gun designed to lob a 33-pound shell at a target 7 kilometers away. A gun whose entire purpose is to kill people you cannot see. But this morning, the breech is open and the barrel isn't pointed at the sky. It's pointed almost level with the dirt. It's pointed at a wave of Viet Cong infantry, sprinting across open ground, screaming, no more than 30 meters from where he's standing. His hands are shaking, but they remember the drill. He slides around home. Not high explosive, not white phosphorus. Something almost nobody at this firebase has ever seen fired in combat before. An M546 anti-personnel projectile. A beehive round. 8,000-inch long steel darts, flechettes, packed inside a thin aluminum casing like nails in a coffee can, ready to launch at 3 times the speed of sound. The lieutenant beside him gives the order. He yanks the lanyard. The howitzer doesn't fire. It vomits. A cone of muzzle flash, blue smoke, and a wall of steel needles erupts from the barrel. The Viet Cong soldiers in front of it don't fall down. They don't crumple. They disappear, wiped from the morning humidity like chalk from a blackboard. A red haze hangs in the air for 1 full second before the next wave breaks through it. Alaska 47S firing, screaming the same words over and over again. Tajin Ule, advance. This is the deadliest thing this young artilleryman has ever seen in his life. And around the clearing, on the other 16 howitzers of his battalion, his friends are doing exactly the same thing. By the time the smoke clears, 5 hours later, 647 enemy bodies will be stacked, in places 4 deep, around the dirt perimeter of a base that didn't even exist 5 days earlier. A base called Firebase Gold. This is the story of how 450 Americans, in a clearing in the jungle, survived an enemy force more than 5 times their size. And it is the story of how the men who attacked them made one of the deadliest miscalculations of the entire Vietnam War. For the soldiers in the tree line at dawn that morning, this was supposed to be easy. They were the 272nd Viet Cong Regiment, the pride of the 9th Division. Elite by communist standards, veterans of the war against the French, hardened by 10 years in the jungle before most of the Americans they were about to attack had finished high school. They had overrun South Vietnamese battalions. They had ambushed American paratroopers. They had wiped Special Forces patrols off the map. Their commander believed, with absolute conviction, that 2,500 of his men could overrun a 450-man American outpost before breakfast. What he didn't know, what nobody in that tree line knew, was that the man in command of the artillery at the center of that firebase had been in this exact situation before. Not in this jungle, but in this exact situation. 23 years earlier, in the freezing winter of 1944, a young American sergeant had crouched in a foxhole at Anzio, Italy, as German infantry came across an open field. The Americans were outnumbered. They were short on ammunition. The position looked indefensible. That sergeant performed so well under fire that his officers took the rare step of giving him a battlefield commission, pulling him out of the ranks of the enlisted and making him an officer right there on the line. Most men who got those commissions went home after the war, took off the uniform, and got on with their lives. This one didn't. This one stayed. He stayed for 23 years. He fought through the rest of World War II. He served in Korea. He spent his career in artillery, learning every line of every manual, every angle, every quirk of a fuse, every limitation of a powder charge. By March of 1967, he was a 44-year-old lieutenant colonel with the kind of quiet, weather-beaten competence that nobody writes books about. His name was John William Vessey Jr., and on the morning of March 21st, he was the senior officer in command of the guns at Firebase Gold. 16 years after this morning, the President of the United States would appoint him the 10th chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the highest uniform position in the entire American military. He would be the first, and remains to this day the only man in American history, to rise from drafted enlisted private all the way to 4-star general and chairman. But that's the ending of the story. The beginning is this: the 272nd Regiment thought it had picked an easy target. They thought they were hitting a half-built American outpost in the middle of nowhere. They thought their numbers, their surprise, and their fanaticism would carry them through the barbed wire in 30 minutes flat. They were wrong about every single one of those things. And before the sun reached its peak that morning, the jungle around Firebase Gold would belong to the dead. To understand why this battle happened, and why it ended the way it did, we have to go to a place on the map that by 1967 the American military had given its own name. They called it War Zone C. It was a wedge of dense, triple canopy jungle in Tây Ninh province, in the northwestern corner of South Vietnam, pressed up against the Cambodian border like a closed fist. Roughly 90 to 100 kilometers northwest of Saigon, mostly empty of villages, mostly empty of roads, almost entirely the property of the enemy. In World War II, when armies fought in Europe, you could draw lines on maps. The Germans were on one side, the Allies were on the other. You knew where the front was because the artillery told you. There was no front in War Zone C. There were no lines. There were no flags marking territory. There was only jungle so thick that two men could stand 5 meters apart and never see each other. Bamboo so high it blocked the sun at noon. Streams that turned into roads and back into streams when the rains came. Snakes the locals called two-step vipers, a name they earned because that was about how far you got after they bit you. Mosquitoes that carried malaria. Leeches that climbed up the inside of your trouser leg without you ever feeling it. And running through all of it, invisible from the air, almost untouchable from the ground, was the most important enemy installation in all of South Vietnam. The Americans called it COSVN, the Central Office for South Vietnam. It was the communist command structure that ran the entire war in the South. Every Viet Cong main force unit, every regional battalion, every supply line down the Ho Chi Minh Trail, every political officer, every village cell, every operation against American forces. All of it was coordinated, on paper, from a network of bunkers, thatched huts, and radio shacks, hidden somewhere in War Zone C, where the trees were thick enough to swallow a B-52 strike whole, and the border with Cambodia was close enough that, if things got too hot, you could just walk across the line, and the Americans couldn't follow. For 3 years, American intelligence had been trying to put a pin on a map showing where COSVN was. They listened to radio traffic, they sent in scouts, they turned prisoners, they flew low-level photo missions, they got close, but they never quite managed to pin it down. By the end of 1966, the 4-star American general commanding the war, General William Childs Westmoreland, had run out of patience. If they couldn't find COSVN, he decided, they would smash the jungle that hid it. He started planning the largest American military operation of the entire war, Operation Junction City. The operation was called Junction City. The name came from a small town in Kansas. Westmoreland's chief of staff was from there. The mission was anything but small. The plan, drawn up during the second half of 1966 and finalized in early 1967, called for the largest concentration of American combat power, assembled in a single operation in the entire Vietnam War. More than 30,000 troops, 22 American infantry battalions, plus 4 South Vietnamese battalions, 17 artillery battalions, several armored cavalry squadrons, nearly 3,000 tactical air sorties to support it. There was even a brigade-sized parachute drop, the only combat jump made by American paratroopers in the entire Vietnam War, to seal the northern edge of the area. The goal was deceptively simple. Surround War Zone C with a horseshoe of American units. Sweep west to east through the jungle with infantry. Drive everything that moved against the wall on the far side. Find COSVN. Destroy it. It was a hammer designed to flatten a hornet's nest. What Westmoreland did not realize, and what would shape every battle that followed, including Firebase Gold, was that for the first time in the war, his enemy was preparing to fight him head-on. Not ambush, not hit and run, stand-up battle. Because for once, the man running the war from the other side had decided to stay and fight. The Viet Cong commander in the south was a 49-year-old general named Tran Van Tra. He was a hawk in a movement of hawks. He had fought the Japanese during World War II. He had fought the French at Dien Bien Phu. He believed in his bones that the war against the Americans would be won not by hiding in the jungle, but by hitting them hard, the way communist forces had once hit the French. In Hanoi, the legendary general Von An Gap, the architect of the French defeat, had been telling political leaders for over a year that the South wasn't ready for set-piece battle. Don't fight the Americans where they are strongest, Gap argued. Don't mass for them. Don't give them targets. American artillery and air power can level any battlefield they can identify. Stay invisible. Bleed them slow. Tran Van Tra didn't agree. When Junction City began at the end of February 1967, Tra had a choice. He could melt his forces into the Cambodian sanctuaries until the Americans got tired and went home. Or he could stand and fight in War Zone C, exactly as the Americans were daring him to do. He chose to fight. He had 2 divisions of regulars under his command in the south. The 9th VC Division, made up mostly of southern guerrillas who had been promoted to main force units, and the 7th NVA Division, full of regulars infiltrated from the north. He had elite regiments. He had the 271st. He had the 272nd. He had the 273rd. He had veterans, weapons, sappers, mortar teams, and the home ground advantage of fighting in a jungle they had walked since they were children. So when American helicopters started landing in War Zone C, Tra gave the order that would set up everything that came next. Find an isolated American firebase, hit it hard, destroy it, and then ambush the relief column that has to come and save it. He had no way of knowing that the firebase his 272nd Regiment would pick was Firebase Gold. He had no way of knowing what John Vessey was about to do with 17 Howitzers and a box of beehive rounds. He was about to find out. By 1967, John Vessey had been in uniform for 27 years. He had enlisted in the Minnesota National Guard as a 16-year-old, lying about his age to get in. By 1939, he was a teenager carrying a rifle. By 1944, he was a 22-year-old first sergeant in Italy with the 34th Infantry Division, the Red Bulls, fighting through some of the worst combat of the European War. At Anzio, in February of that year, his unit was being chewed up by German artillery and counterattacks. American officers were dying faster than they could be replaced. Vessey, by that point, was running things that should have been a captain's job, so his battalion commander gave him a battlefield commission. The Army's quiet way of saying, "You're an officer now because we need officers more than we need paperwork." He never gave the commission back. He stayed through the war. He stayed through Korea. He served in a dozen unglamorous postings. He never picked up the kind of biography that magazine writers love. No famous moments, no movie star jaw, no headlines. Just decade after decade of being the man other officers trusted to do the unsexy job right, artillery in particular. Vessey understood guns the way some men understand engines. He could look at a tube and tell you what was wrong with it. He could brief a brigadier on fire support without notes. He could re-aim a battery in his head. By March 1967, he was the lieutenant colonel commanding 2nd Battalion, 77th Field Artillery, part of the 3rd Brigade of the 4th Infantry Division, attached for this operation to the legendary 25th Infantry Division. He was 44 years old, married, with kids back home, the kind of officer who didn't raise his voice. The kind who, when something went wrong, asked one quiet question and listened to the answer. He had never personally fought in jungle combat at this scale before. Nobody at Firebase Gold had. The men around him were mostly draftees, mostly in their early 20s, mostly on their first combat tour. 16 of his 17 105mm howitzers had never been fired in close quarters defense before. Doctrine said they never would. Doctrine said you put your guns behind the infantry, not in front of them. Doctrine said you fired arcing, indirect, from kilometers away. But sometime in the next 96 hours, Doctrine was going to die in a clearing in the jungle, and John Vessey was going to be the man who killed it. March 19th, 1967, 2 days before the battle. At first light that morning, the helicopters started lifting out of Taining base camp. Heavy CH-47 Chinooks slung howitzers underneath them on long steel cables. Up-1 Hueys carried infantry. The air was already hot. The men inside the helicopters were wearing flak jackets over jungle fatigues, sweating into their helmets before the rotors even spun up. The landing zone was a clearing near an abandoned hamlet called Sui Tre, Bamboo Creek. On the maps, it was nothing. A patch of dry red dirt the size of a few football fields, surrounded on every side by triple canopy jungle. The clearing existed only because some Vietnamese farmer, decades earlier, had cut down enough trees to grow rice there, then walked away when the war made farming impossible. It was a perfect spot for a firebase, flat, open, good fields of fire, helicopter accessible, close enough to the suspected KSVN area to put artillery on targets in support of the infantry sweeps. It was also, the Americans were about to learn, exactly the kind of place the Viet Cong had been preparing for months. At about 700 a.m., as the first wave of helicopters came in low over the trees, the Viet Cong sappers detonated the surprise they had been saving. They had buried command-detonated mines in the landing zone. Not pressure mines, command-detonated. Which meant somewhere in the tree line, hidden in a spider hole, a Viet Cong with a wire and a hand-crank detonator was watching American helicopters descend and waiting for them to be low enough. The blast caught 3 Hueys directly. 3 more were damaged. The men inside, soldiers who had been joking about sea rations and trading cigarettes 30 seconds earlier, were thrown sideways into the dirt as their helicopters cartwheeled and burned. 15 Americans were killed in those opening seconds. 28 more were wounded. The clearing filled with smoke before the first organized rifle had been fired. It was, the surviving officers realized almost immediately, a warning, a signature. The enemy was telling them, "We know you are coming. We have been here. We will be back." The next wave of helicopters came in anyway. They had no choice. The mission was the mission. Firebase Gold had to be built. The infantry secured the perimeter. Engineers swept the rest of the clearing for mines. Medics worked on the burned. The dead were tagged and loaded into outbound helicopters. Then the Howitzers came in, swinging beneath the Chinooks, settling into the red dirt one by one. By nightfall on March 19th, Firebase Gold existed. By dawn on the 20th, it looked like every other American firebase in Vietnam, a five-pointed star carved out of the jungle, with 17 105mm howitzers in gun pits at its center, foxholes and bunkers around the outside perimeter, sandbag walls hastily stacked, concertina wire and trip flares strung between the trees, M45 Quad 50 machine gun mounts at the cardinal points, and 700 meters of cleared field of fire stretching out toward the tree line. It looked solid. It wasn't, because there were only 2 American infantry companies inside that perimeter, roughly 300 riflemen, plus the artillerymen, plus a handful of mortar crews and medics and signalers. The 3rd Infantry Company and most of the rest of the supporting battalion had marched out the previous afternoon on a search and destroy mission deeper into the jungle. They were now 4 kilometers away through some of the densest bamboo in the province. The men inside Firebase Gold were on their own. They didn't know it yet. What Tran Van Tan and his commanders knew, and what made them confident, was that everything they were planning to do at Firebase Gold, they had already tried just 11 days earlier. On March 10, 1967, an estimated 2,500 Viet Cong soldiers had attacked another newly built American firebase to the southeast, called Pret Clock 2. It had been a near-perfect setup for the communists. 2 battalions of infantry, artillery support inside the wire, 3 sides of jungle to attack from. They came in waves, before dawn, screaming, hitting the perimeter in human wave assaults. The Americans had done something the Viet Cong didn't expect. They had leveled their artillery. At Pret Clock, the American gunners had cranked their 105s down to direct fire and shot horizontally into the assaulting infantry. They had used high-explosive shells, fused to detonate just out of the muzzle. They had used cleared-of-time fused beehive rounds at point-blank range. By the time the sun came up that morning, the attacking Viet Cong had lost an estimated 197 dead. The Americans had lost 3. A 65-to-1 kill ratio. For any sane military commander, this would have been a clarifying experience. It would have been a screaming, blinking, neon-lit warning sign that says do not attack American firebases head-on. For Tran Van Tra, it was something else. It was, in his interpretation, a fluke, a failure of execution, a failure to mass enough men, a failure to hit hard enough. Pret Clock had been attacked with 1 regiment. Firebase Gold, he decided, would be attacked with a stronger one, the 272nd, and supported by an even larger reserve. They would not give the Americans time to organize. They would hit harder. They would mass infantry behind a wall of mortar fire. They would overwhelm one sector of the perimeter before the rest of the base could react. And then, when the inevitable American relief column came marching through the jungle to save them, and the column would have to come, because that's what Americans did, the 272nd Reserve would ambush them on the way. It was a good plan, on paper. It was the kind of plan that respected the Americans enough to commit serious force against them, but not so much that it admitted the doctrine itself was broken. It was the plan of a man who had not yet learned the most expensive lesson of his career. The men inside Firebase Gold were not stupid. They knew something was coming. They had been on this kind of ground long enough to know what it felt like when the jungle was about to come alive. Late on the afternoon of March 20th, patrols sent out beyond the perimeter began reporting things, boot prints in the soft dirt that didn't belong to American jungle boots, cooking fire ash, recently extinguished, in places nobody should have been, bent grass in patterns that suggested an entire column of men had moved through, single file, the previous night. Late that night, a listening post at the edge of the perimeter, a 2-man outpost with a radio, reported whispers in the dark, not loud, not close, just a faint, scrubbed-out sound of voices that shouldn't have been there. A few minutes later, the same listening post reported the metallic clink of weapons being adjusted, magazines being seated, bolts being eased. The men on the perimeter were already in their fighting positions. Officers ordered an extra round of ammunition issued. The mortar crews registered defensive concentrations on the most likely avenues of approach. The artillerymen preset their guns on direct fire targets at known azimuths around the perimeter. Then the men sat in their holes, smoked their cigarettes down to the filters, drank coffee from steel canteen cups, and waited. At 4:30 in the morning, on March 21st, a small ambush patrol from Company A, 8 men, sent out hours earlier to set up a position along a likely enemy approach, broke radio silence with a single, hurried transmission. Movement, heavy movement, many enemy. Then, the radio went silent. That was the last anyone at Firebase Gold heard from that patrol for the next several hours. Every man on it would be killed or wounded in the next 90 minutes. The lucky ones managed to crawl back through the jungle to friendly lines after the battle began. Some never came back at all. In the gun pits, the artillerymen looked at each other in the orange light of their map-reading lanterns. They didn't need anyone to tell them what the silence meant. It meant the 272nd Regiment was already here. The mortar barrage came first. At exactly 6:30 in the morning, just as the first edge of grey light was bleeding into the eastern sky, more than 650 mortar rounds came down on Firebase Gold in the opening minutes of the attack. 60mm, 82mm, some 120mm heavies. The shells walked across the perimeter in waves, blasting craters into the red dirt, shredding sandbag walls, collapsing 2 of the makeshift bunkers, killing men where they stood. For the soldiers in their fighting holes, the world reduced itself instantly to noise and dirt. The crack of the rounds going off, the whine of fragments, the smell of cordite, of burning rubber from a flat jacket, of blood, a radio handset chattering, somebody shouting for a medic, somebody else screaming the same name over and over. And then, just as the mortar fire began to lift, just as the human ear could start to hear the world again, came the second sound, the horns. The 272nd Regiment used bugles to coordinate its assault waves. Long horns, whistle blasts, shouted commands in Vietnamese rippling through the tree line. From the eastern edge of the clearing, the jungle vomited men, hundreds of them, then more behind them, then more, wave after wave of Viet Cong infantry sprinting across the open ground toward the eastern perimeter of Firebase Gold, firing AK-47s and SKS rifles from the hip, slinging grenades, screaming the same word over and over again, Tengule, advance. The main weight of the assault hit Company B, holding the eastern perimeter. At the same time, a secondary attack, a feint, in the proper military sense, but real enough to anyone in its path, hit the western and southern sides to keep the defenders from reinforcing each other. The 272nd had come prepared. American after-action reports later catalogued what they recovered from the battlefield: 50 RPG-2 rocket launchers, 30 light machine guns, 49 AK-47s, 13 Browning automatic rifles captured from earlier ambushes of South Vietnamese units, more than 30,000 rounds of small arms ammunition, nearly 2,000 stick grenades prepared and pre-tied for throwing. It was the equipment of an army that had every intention of finishing the job before lunch. For the Americans, the next 90 minutes would feel like the longest of their lives. 7:11 a.m. Company B in trouble. The first crisis came at 7:11 in the morning, just 41 minutes after the mortar barrage had opened. On the eastern perimeter, the first platoon of Company B was being overrun. The Viet Cong infantry had taken horrible casualties getting across the open ground. Every American machine gun on that perimeter was firing, but enough of them had reached the wire to start clipping their way through. They threw bamboo mats over the concertina. They tossed satchel charges into the foxholes. They climbed across the bodies of their own dead. By 7:11, the leading edge of the enemy assault was inside the perimeter on the eastern side. Captain Stephen Holt, the Company B commander, a young infantry officer with weeks of company command experience and now decades of consequence packed into a single morning, was on the radio to brigade and to Vessey at the gun line and to his own platoons at the same time, all of it at once, all of it shouted, all of it under fire. Holt called in close air support, an Air Force forward air controller orbiting overhead, a single pilot in a tiny propeller-driven O-1 Bird Dog spotter plane, ties on the battlefield, vectored in a flight of F-4 Phantom jets loaded with napalm. The Phantoms came in low, screaming over the jungle. They dropped their tanks of jellied gasoline so close to American positions that the heat singed the eyebrows of the men in the foxholes. The eastern tree line turned into a wall of orange fire that incinerated entire knots of Viet Cong infantry caught moving in the open. It still wasn't enough. By 7:50 a.m., Company B was running out of ammunition. The riflemen on the eastern perimeter had been firing for almost an hour and a half at hundreds of advancing enemy soldiers. Magazines were empty, bandoliers were empty. The reserve ammunition was being passed forward from hand to hand, but it wasn't going to last. Holt got back on the radio. His next request, to John Vessey at the gun line, was one that no infantry captain wants to make in his career. He asked for direct fire from the Howitzers into his own perimeter. Not the wire, not just outside it, into the perimeter, because the enemy was that close. The enemy was inside. In any other army, in any other war, the answer to a request like that might have been, "We can't. It's too dangerous. We'll hit you." Vessey's answer, by every account that survives, was simple. On the way, around the 17 gun pits at the center of Firebase Gold, John Vessey was already moving. By that point in the battle, 14 of his 17 105mm howitzers had been damaged by the opening mortar fire, punctured tires, cracked sights, shrapnel-pitted breech blocks. Crews wounded or killed. A couple of guns were just gone, direct hits. A lesser officer might have written off the battalion. Most of the guns were broken. Most of the crews were taking casualties. The infantry was being overrun. Standard procedure would be to call for evacuation and consolidate to the surviving guns. That is not what Vessey did. He walked. He literally walked from gun pit to gun pit, with mortar fragments hissing through the air around him. He found his executive officer. He found his chief warrant officer. He found the sergeants who actually knew which busted howitzer could be made to fire again and which one couldn't. He directed crew-served repairs by hand on his knees in the dirt, while AK-47 rounds were already cracking overhead from the breach perimeter. He pulled men off broken guns and stuffed them into the crews of working ones. He had ammunition handlers rerouting pallets of shells under fire. He had radio operators screaming target data into headsets, while shrapnel rang off helmets. Within minutes, no more than 15, by the most careful reconstruction, every howitzer in the battalion that could be made to fire was firing again. 3 of them were beyond saving. 14 were alive. And then he gave the order that nobody before him had ever given in the Vietnam War at this scale. Lower the tubes, direct fire, beehive, fire at will. To understand what happened next, you have to understand what a beehive round actually is, because it sounds, when you describe it, almost like a joke. A 33-pound shotgun shell, steel darts, fired out of a howitzer. It sounds like something a child would draw on a notebook in middle school. It was none of those things. Of the beehive round, officially the M546 APRS-T, was developed for the United States Army during the early 1960s as a direct response to a problem that infantry officers in Korea had been begging the Pentagon to solve. What do you do when an artillery position gets rushed by enemy infantry at point-blank range? A howitzer is a long-range weapon. Its high explosive shells need space. They have to arm. They have a minimum range fuse delay. When the enemy is 50 meters from your gun line, your normal shells are dangerous to you before they are dangerous to him. The beehive solved that problem in the simplest, most savage way possible. Inside each shell, packed into a thin aluminum cylinder, were 8,000 finned steel darts. They were about an inch long each. They had 4 small fins to stabilize them in flight, like miniature crossbow bolts. When the howitzer fired, the cylinder traveled out of the muzzle. Then, at a preset time, or if the timer was disabled, almost instantly burst open, releasing the darts in a forward expanding cone at roughly 1,000 meters per second. The result was not a shell, it was a cloud. A horizontal storm of steel needles, expanding from the muzzle at 3 times the speed of sound, that could shred a company of infantry in the open. In normal use, beehives were fired with their fuses set for low airburst, a few hundred meters out, a few meters up, to rain darts down on troops in the open. They were rare in combat. Most American firebases had only a few rounds per gun, stockpiled in case the worst should happen. The training was minimal. The procedure was experimental. What John Vessey ordered that morning was not normal use. He ordered his crews to disable the time fuses, set them to 0, effectively to detonate the darts the moment they left the tube. Then he ordered his crews to lower the gun barrels until they were almost level with the dirt, to aim them, like rifles, at the wave of advancing Viet Cong infantry. He was about to use 17 105mm howitzers, like 17 of the largest shotguns ever fielded by the United States military. Around the gun line, his crews followed orders. They cranked the trails, they lowered the tubes, they slid the heavy aluminum-cased beehive rounds into the breaches, the lanyards were pulled. Witnesses afterward would describe the sound as something almost impossible to put into words. A howitzer firing a high-explosive shell makes a particular clean crack that you can hear from kilometers away. A howitzer firing a beehive round at 0 degrees of elevation, with the timer disabled, made a sound none of them had ever heard before. A coughing, hissing roar, like a giant exhale. And then, in the front of the gun, the impossible visual, a cone of muzzle flash and steel that crossed the open ground in a half blink, painting the air red. 40 beehive rounds were fired by the battalion that morning. When the beehives ran out, the gun crews switched to high explosive shells, fired horizontally, with delayed fuses, exploding in the middle of the assaulting infantry. By the end of the battle, Vessey's 17 guns had expended over 2,000 rounds of artillery, much of it in direct fire at distances of 50 meters or less. Survivors of Company B, walking through the eastern perimeter later that day, would describe what they found. Bodies of Viet Cong soldiers stacked in piles, 3 and 4 deep. Foxholes that looked like mass graves. A wide, blackened furrow of churned up dirt and bodies leading back toward the tree line, the literal path of the howitzer fire marked into the ground itself. One of the artillerymen, decades later, would still not be able to describe what he had seen without choosing his words very carefully. He would only say that he had seen things that morning that no 22-year-old should ever see. 8:15 a.m. Charged through enemy lines while the gun line was burning the eastern tree line to the ground. Something was happening on the southern side of the firebase that even today reads more like a fable than a military report. A platoon from Company A, the one outside the perimeter at the start of the attack, was still alive. They were cut off. They were behind enemy lines in the literal sense. They had been on ambush duty hundreds of meters out from the firebase when the assault started, and by the time they realized the size of what they were facing, every Viet Cong soldier between them and Firebase Gold was already on the move. The platoon leader had two options. One was to dig in where they were, hide in the bamboo, and pray to live through the morning. The other was insane. He chose the insane one. At about 8:15 a.m., that platoon stood up out of the jungle behind the Viet Cong assault force, lined themselves up in a rough wedge, and charged, not away from the firebase, toward it, through the rear of the enemy formation. They moved with rifles up, firing as they went, throwing grenades into anything that looked like a fighting position. Most of the Viet Cong they encountered weren't looking backward. They were focused on the perimeter ahead of them. The Americans went through their flanks like a knife through wet paper. They took casualties, but they kept moving, every man on his feet, every weapon firing. The platoon reached the southern perimeter of Firebase Gold a few minutes later, alive, exhausted, bleeding, and the men inside the wire, who had assumed the platoon was lost, recognized them and started shouting and firing, covering fire at the same time. By 8:25 a.m., that platoon was back inside the firebase. Their lieutenant was hoarse. Their company commander, when he saw them come over the wire, reportedly did not say a word for several seconds. He just stared. It is one of those moments in military history that defies normal description. It should not have worked. There is no manual in the world that recommends it, and yet, by all surviving accounts, that single decision to attack into the rear of the assault disrupted the Viet Cong's organization on the southern flank just enough to make a difference in the next 20 minutes. In the next 20 minutes, those 20 minutes were the difference between a defended firebase and a destroyed one. 8:25 a.m. The perimeter breaks, but it was, for a moment, very close. By 8:25, the northern perimeter was breached. One of the M45 Quad 50 machine gun positions, a vehicle-mounted weapon with 4 50 caliber machine guns firing in synchronized horror at the enemy, was overrun. Its crew, knowing they had no time to escape with the weapon, did what they were trained to do. They pulled the pins on thermite grenades, dropped them into the weapon's mechanism, and ran for their lives. The grenade melted the machine guns to slag rather than letting them fall into Viet Cong hands. By 8:30, Viet Cong soldiers were within 15 meters of the artillery guns themselves, within 5 meters of the medical aid station where wounded Americans were lying on stretchers in the open. The fight on the eastern side was, for several minutes, hand-to-hand, bayonets, pistols, entrenching tools. This is where the gun crews became infantrymen. Artillerymen are not, traditionally, expected to be riflemen. They have rifles, but their hands are usually busy with shells. Vessey's men, that morning, fought with both. They served the guns, they fired the guns, and then when Viet Cong infantry got close enough that they could see faces, they pulled their personal weapons and fought as riflemen. Cooks fired rifles, mechanics threw grenades. A radio operator emptied a magazine into an enemy soldier who had jumped down into his foxhole. The fight was everywhere at once, and out in front of them, on the eastern tree line, the howitzers kept firing. Imagine the visual. Imagine standing 50 meters in front of a howitzer, firing a beehive round at 0 degrees elevation. Imagine the muzzle flash. Imagine the wall of steel. Imagine running into it, in a column with the man on your left and the man on your right, because you have been told that this is the moment of revolutionary victory, and the duty of your life is to die for it if necessary. Imagine the crew of the gun, after the round leaves the barrel, slamming another one into the breech as fast as their hands will move. Imagine the lanyard being pulled again. That was the morning of March 21st, 1967. That was what the men at Firebase Gold did to defend their wire, and it was not enough on its own. It was holding the line by inches. It was buying time. The time they were buying was for the relief column. The 2nd Battalion of the 12th Infantry was 4 kilometers away. They had marched out of Firebase Gold the previous afternoon on a search and destroy sweep into the jungle to the west, looking for VC supply caches. Their commander was Lieutenant Colonel Joe Elliott, an infantry officer with a reputation for getting his men where they needed to be, on foot, no matter what the terrain looked like. When the first call came over the radio at about 6:40 a.m., Firebase Gold is under attack. Return immediately. Elliot turned his battalion around in the jungle and started pushing east, hard. 4 kilometers on a road, in good light, takes a man maybe 40 minutes to walk. 4 kilometers, through triple canopy warzone C jungle, against organized enemy resistance, while carrying wounded, takes much longer than that. The 272nd Regiment had not forgotten the second half of their plan. They had positioned blocking forces, specifically to stop the relief column, snipers in trees, squad-sized ambushes along the most obvious trails, mortar teams pre-registered on likely choke points. For Elliot's men, the 4 kilometers between them and Firebase Gold became the longest distance of their lives. They moved in 2 columns, taking turns laying down covering fire, while the other column advanced. They treated their wounded on the march without stopping. They threw grenades into bamboo whenever they thought they saw movement. Trees fell across the trail in front of them. Booby traps tripped beneath the boots of their pointmen. Men died. The columns kept moving. One veteran, decades later, said the most vivid memory he carried out of Vietnam wasn't the firebase itself. It was the 4 kilometers of jungle on March 21st, 1967. It was the knowledge that if they did not get there in time, 300 of their brothers were going to be wiped out, and that they were running through gunfire to make sure they didn't. They covered 4 kilometers in roughly 2 hours and 20 minutes, through enemy positions, under fire, with casualties, at about 900 a.m. The lead elements of 2nd Battalion, 12th Infantry burst through the tree line on the southwestern edge of Firebase Gold. They immediately rolled into a counterattack, hitting the Viet Cong flank from a direction the enemy had not expected. It helped. It was not enough. But 12 minutes after Elliot's infantry arrived, the 2nd Relief Force arrived. And the 2nd Relief Force changed everything. The armor and a sunken APC. The 2nd Battalion of the 34th Armor, equipped with M48 Patton main battle tanks, and the 2nd Battalion of the 34th Armor, 22nd Mechanized Infantry, riding M113 armored personnel carriers, had been part of the same operation, attached to the same brigade. They had received the same emergency call. They had been trying for the better part of 24 hours to find a way to cross a stream called the Suai Samat, a tributary of the bigger watercourse that gave Firebase Gold its general area. The Suai Samat, on the map, was a thin blue line. In the dry season, it could be waded across. But this was not the dry season. The banks were steep, slick, and unstable. 2 of their tanks had already gotten badly stuck trying to ford it. The engineers had not yet been able to build a proper crossing. With the firebase under attack and the relief mission turning into a race against time, the armor needed a bridge that didn't exist. So they made one. They drove an M113 armored personnel carrier into the middle of the stream bed, into the deepest part, and sank it. On purpose. They abandoned it. They turned it into a steel pillar. Then they drove their M48 Patton tanks across the top of it, using the half-submerged APC as a ramp, an artificial step in the bottom of the creek, just enough to break the grade. It was the kind of improvisation that gets written about in books a generation later as a moment of brilliant American problem-solving. At the time, it was just a couple of tankers and engineers screaming at each other to go, 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 while the radio kept telling them the firebase was being overrun. At about 9:12 a.m., 12 minutes after Elliot's infantry had hit the southwest perimeter, the tanks finally cracked through the jungle. What the Viet Cong saw was something they had not prepared to see. 40-ton M48 main battle tanks, in line, churning out of the trees on the western edge of the clearing. .50 caliber machine guns hammering. Their main 90mm guns elevated low, firing canister rounds packed with steel balls. The tank cannon equivalent of the Howitzers' beehives. M113 armored personnel carriers, with their own .50 cals tracing arcs of red tracer across the tree line. The tanks did not stop. They drove into the assault force. What had been, 10 minutes earlier, a coordinated infantry attack with a chance, however slim, of breaking the firebase, became, in the space of about 15 minutes, a slaughter in the open. The Viet Cong infantry on the eastern side of the perimeter had nowhere to go. The artillery was in front of them. The infantry was in front of them. Now armored cavalry was behind them. By 9:30 a.m., the perimeter of Firebase Gold was once again entirely in American hands. By 11:45 a.m., the battle was, in any meaningful sense, over. For the men who walked Firebase Gold's perimeter at noon, what they saw was not victory in any way they recognized. It was carnage. The clearing in front of the eastern perimeter, where Vessey's beehives had done their work, was almost unrecognizable as ground. The vegetation had been stripped to bare dirt. The bodies were stacked, in places, 4 deep. Veterans of the day, decades later in interviews, would describe finding rifles still gripped in the hands of dead soldiers whose bodies had been so torn apart by flechettes that the rifles were the only intact thing to look at. American forces counted 647 Viet Cong bodies on the field by the end of the day. Intelligence officers later estimated that at least 200 more had been carried away by retreating units, common practice in Viet Cong doctrine to deny the Americans an accurate body count. 7 prisoners were taken alive, 2 of whom died of their wounds shortly after capture. American losses were 31 killed and 187 wounded. Of the wounded, 95 were treated and returned to duty the same day. The remaining 92 were evacuated to higher-level medical facilities. The kill ratio was greater than 20-1. Some accounts put it higher. That afternoon, the American armored vehicles did something that became one of the more haunting images of the entire operation. Bulldozer blade-equipped tanks scraped 2 enormous pits into the clearing. The bodies of the Viet Cong dead, what remained of the 272nd Regiment, were collected and laid in those pits in mass graves. One veteran, an enlisted man with the artillery battalion, would write decades later about eating his cold lunch ration that day. He sat on the edge of one of those mass graves with his feet hanging into the pit. He didn't know what else to do with himself. "It is hard to describe," he wrote, "the strangeness of being 22 years old, alive, with the taste of beef stew still in your mouth, sitting on the lip of a hole that held 600 dead men whom the morning's events had made your enemy." The Americans recovered an enormous weapons cache from the battlefield. The list of captured equipment was almost an entire division's worth of small arms: 50 RPG-2 rocket launchers, 30 light machine guns, 49 AK-47s, 13 Browning automatic rifles, some 31,000 rounds of small arms ammunition, nearly 2,000 stick grenades, documents, maps, codes, a complete intelligence haul. Later that afternoon, a single Huey helicopter set down at Firebase Gold. The general who climbed out of it was William Childs Westmoreland, the 4-star commander of all American forces in Vietnam. He walked the perimeter with John Vessey and Marshal Garth, the brigade commander. He looked at the bodies. He looked at the Howitzers, scorched and pitted and still smelling of burnt powder. He looked at the wounded, being loaded onto evacuation helicopters. Westmoreland had spent his entire command in Vietnam betting on a particular theory. The theory was that if you could lure the communist enemy into massing for set-piece battles against American firepower, you would destroy them faster than they could replace themselves. He called it attrition. Critics called it many less polite things. But standing in the clearing at Firebase Gold that afternoon, looking at a 20-1 kill ratio at the end of a 6-hour battle, Westmoreland believed he was looking at proof that his theory worked. For his actions during the battle, John Vessey was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross, the United States Army's second highest decoration for valor, second only to the Medal of Honor. His citation read, in part, that with complete disregard for his own safety, Lieutenant Colonel Vessey repeatedly moved through the firebase under enemy fire, encouraging his men, directing repairs, and personally leading counterattacks to restore broken defensive positions. The 3rd Brigade of the 4th Infantry Division, every unit involved in the defense of Firebase Gold, received the Presidential Unit Citation for extraordinary heroism in action. It is one of the highest honors a unit can be awarded. In practical terms, it meant that every single soldier in those units, from the brigade commander to the youngest private, was officially honored as though he personally had received the Distinguished Service Cross. For the men in the foxholes that morning, what had happened was personal. For the war as a whole, it was the start of something larger. The 272nd Regiment was not just defeated at Firebase Gold, it was destroyed. The southern cadres of the Viet Cong, men who had been recruited from villages within 10 kilometers of where they fought, men who had been guerrillas against the French, men whose family connections and local knowledge made them irreplaceable, were gone. Most of them now lay in the mass graves that the American tanks had dug that afternoon. The 272nd was rebuilt later in 1967, but it was rebuilt with North Vietnamese Army regulars infiltrated south down the Ho Chi Minh Trail. The southern character of the Southern Revolution, its native cadres, its local roots, its village-by-village credibility, never fully recovered from the losses of 1967, of which Firebase Gold was only one example. For Tran Van Tra personally, the lesson was bitter, and it took time to arrive. His belief that elite Viet Cong units could overrun American firebases in conventional set-piece battle could not survive the body count of March 1967. Over the following months, in the senior councils of the Communist Command, the debate that had been raging for years between Traz School and General Giap's School of Warfare resolved itself. Traz tactics were not working. Direct attacks on American fortified positions were a meat grinder, and the meat was the Viet Cong's own. But Trao was not a man who admitted defeat by stopping. He admitted defeat, and many historians would argue this was the only kind of admission he ever made, by escalating. If you could not destroy the Americans in the jungle, on the fire bases, where their artillery and air power were strongest, then you would have to fight them somewhere else. Somewhere they could not bring all their firepower to bear. Somewhere their own civilian advisors and their own newspapers and their own political leaders would see the war up close. You would have to fight them in the cities. Within weeks of the destruction of the 272nd Regiment at Firebase Gold, KOSVN began planning what would become the largest, most coordinated communist offensive of the entire war. Across nearly every major South Vietnamese city, Saigon, Hue, Da Nang, more than 100 targets simultaneously in the early hours of the Vietnamese New Year. A nationwide assault that would shock the American public and change the political character of the war forever. The world would later know that operation by a single name, the Tet Offensive. January 30th, 1968. 10 months and 9 days after Firebase Gold. Tran Van Tra would not be there to see most of it. He survived the war and lived for decades after it, eventually writing his own controversial memoir. But the architect of the original idea of standing and fighting in the jungle of overwhelming American fire bases was by all accounts a different man in his confidence than the one who had ordered the 272nd Regiment into the clearing at Sui Tre the year before. John Vessey would have no idea that afternoon how far his career still had to climb. He commanded his battalion through the rest of the operation. He went home. He was promoted. He commanded a brigade, then a division, then a corps. He served in Korea again. As deputy commander of all U.S. forces there, he became vice chief of staff of the United States Army. He became a 4-star general. In 1982, President Ronald Reagan was looking for someone to fill the highest uniformed position in the entire American military, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. The chairman is the principal military advisor to the President of the United States. He sits at the table when nuclear strategy is discussed. He briefs Congress on what wars the country can and cannot fight. He is, in the military hierarchy of his own country, almost without peer. Reagan asked for John Vessey. When asked, in the confirmation process, what qualified him for the position, Vessey's reported answer was characteristic. 46 years of service, he said. From private to general, he was the first man, and to this day the only man in American history to rise from drafted enlisted private through battlefield commission all the way to 4-star general and chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. There has never been a career like his, before or since. Most of his postings between Firebase Gold and the chairmanship were not glamorous. None of them appeared in newspapers. He kept his head down. He did the work. He spoke quietly. He served as chairman for 3 years. After he retired, he spent more than a decade as a special presidential envoy negotiating with the government of Vietnam on the issue of American servicemen still missing from the war. The man who had killed the 272nd Regiment in a clearing in War Zone C spent his last years of public service bringing the bones of American soldiers home from the same country. He died in 2016, at the age of 94. He almost never talked publicly about Firebase Gold. When pressed, he would only say that on that morning, in that clearing, his soldiers had done what soldiers do, that they had fought for the men on either side of them, that they had earned every medal they were given, and 100 they were not. The Firebase as a tactical concept did not stop at Firebase Gold. Over the next 8 years of American combat operations in Vietnam, more than 8,000 firebases would be built across the country. Some lasted weeks, some lasted years. Some were abandoned without a shot fired. Some were defended in battles that nobody today remembers the names of. But the doctrine that they encoded, that American artillery, properly emplaced and properly defended, could turn any clearing in a jungle into a death zone for any enemy foolish enough to attack it head-on, was the doctrine that Firebase Gold had written in fire. Within months of the battle, the U.S. Army's Field Artillery School at Fort Sill, Oklahoma, was teaching the lessons of direct-fire howitzer defense as standard curriculum. The beehive round, until 1967, a curiosity in the inventory, was being stockpiled at firebases throughout the country. New crews coming into Vietnam knew the story of what Vessey's men had done at Sui Tre before they had ever seen the inside of a gun pit themselves. To this day, in the U.S. Army's official history of the field artillery in the Vietnam War, the Battle of Firebase Gold is recorded as the most successful direct-fire defensive engagement by American artillery in the entire conflict. Many artillery officers consider it the most successful direct-fire engagement since the Civil War. The men who served on those guns that morning, many of them draftees, many of them barely out of high school, went home, mostly to lives that nobody made a movie about. They became plumbers and accountants and school teachers and grandfathers. They mostly did not talk about Firebase Gold. The ones who did talked about it carefully, with the kind of pauses that men of that war learned to put around words. Decades later, at a reunion ceremony, a former munitions officer named Paige Lanier, who had personally hauled over 2,000 rounds of artillery to the guns that morning, including 41 of the beehives, was asked what the battle meant to him now. Looking back, he answered honestly, "We look at it as a memorial," he said, "not as something to celebrate. We think about the men we lost. We think about all the men we have lost since." His words are probably as honest a summary as anyone has ever offered of what March 21st, 1967 meant to the men who lived through it and to the country they served. So was attacking Firebase Gold really a huge mistake? The numbers are clear. The 272nd Viet Cong regiment was effectively destroyed in less than 6 hours of combat. Roughly 647 of its soldiers were killed in front of the perimeter, and several hundred more were lost in the retreat and in the relief column ambushes that failed. The Americans lost 31 men killed and 187 wounded. Heavy by any measure, but a fraction of what the enemy paid. But the deeper mistake was not tactical, it was strategic. The men who attacked Firebase Gold believed something about American soldiers that was not true. They believed Americans were soft. They believed Americans would not stand. They believed that 450 young men in a clearing, surprised at dawn, hit by hundreds of mortar rounds, attacked by 2,500 enemy infantry, would break. They forgot that some of those 450 young men had grown up on farms in Minnesota and Iowa and Ohio. They forgot that the lieutenant colonel running their artillery had been a sergeant at Anzio. They forgot that there is a particular kind of stubbornness that takes 22-year-old men, drops them in a jungle 8,000 miles from their homes, and turns them into the kind of soldiers who do not run when their officer tells them to lower the guns and fire shotgun shells at human beings 30 meters away. They forgot, in other words, who they were fighting. For the men inside Firebase Gold that morning, the battle was personal. It was about the soldier on your left and the soldier on your right. It was about not letting your friends down. It was about going home. For the war as a whole, Firebase Gold was a hinge. It was one of the moments at which the Communist Command, looking at the kill ratios coming out of War Zone C, realized that conventional warfare in the jungle would never win the war. It pushed the strategy toward the cities. It pushed the strategy toward Tet. And Tet, when it came in 1968, changed the character of the war for everyone. In that sense, the men who attacked Firebase Gold did not just lose a battle. They lost an argument that had been raging inside their own command for years. The argument about whether their war could be won by standing toe-to-toe with the United States military in the jungle. The answer, written in beehive rounds and bulldozer-dug graves in a clearing in Tainan province, was no. That is why attacking Firebase Gold was a mistake. Not because they lost. They had lost battles before, but because they lost the idea, and the idea was the only thing they could not afford to lose. If this story moved you, if the men who fought at Firebase Gold deserved to be remembered for what they did that morning, hit the like button. It genuinely does help the algorithm push videos like this one to other people who care about history. If you have a personal connection to this story, leave a comment. Maybe a grandfather, a great uncle, a friend who served in Vietnam. Maybe you're watching from Tainan or from Minnesota, where John Vessey was born. The comments under this video are where the real history gets shared, the parts you don't find in books. If you're new here, subscribe. We tell stories like this one, the moments where individual courage and tactical decision-making change the course of larger events every week. And as always, thank you for watching to the end. The men in this story deserve to have someone hear them out. You did that. That matters more than you might think.